Whenever you like, sure. Rebecca's going to go up and say, introduce you, but sure. Okay. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Sorry, I'm glad to have you a chance to talk together. Sorry if I interrupted anything. My name is Jeff Blackadar. I'm the president of the Ottawa Horticultural Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our October meeting. We're also welcoming our video audience on YouTube, so thank you very much for joining as well. And we have a great speaker for you tonight. But first, I'll introduce Rebecca Last, who heads our program committee. Rebecca, to introduce our speaker, please.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everybody. I am absolutely delighted tonight to be able to introduce Ben O'Brien of Wild by Design Landscape Company. And Ben is a native of Prince Edward County in rural Ontario. So he spent a lot of his childhood playing in farm fields and fence rows and forests. And his fascination with these environments led him to study landscape architecture at the University of Guelph. Those of us in the room and online who are Master Gardeners are somewhat familiar with that program because that's where we get our Master Gardener qualifications. So it's a terrific program. Ben's passion for exploring the cultural and ecologically enriching capacity of landscape architecture found a particular niche in landscape design based on richly layered naturalistic plantings. So he aims to create landscapes that, while obviously designed, have the same character, atmosphere, and dynamism of those wild places that he grew up with. And his company, Wild by Design, is dedicated to sharing this style of naturalistic planting. And I know he has some fabulous pictures and some really interesting information to share with us tonight. So please help me welcome Ben O'Brien.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to have some in-person gathering and then also be able to stream online at the same time, so that's fun. So thank you to Rebecca for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight, and thank you to Jeff for the tech assistance getting this all set up and organized. So yes, my name is Ben O'Brien, and I design naturalistic gardens in Prince Edward County. And over the past few years, I've become especially interested in gravel gardens, and that's going to be the focus of my talk tonight. First, before we get going, can everyone at the back hear okay? Is that all good? Not as much? Okay. Want me to try the mic or will we move the, is that better? Yes? Okay. All right, we'll go with that. So as Rebecca mentioned, this is my childhood habitat. I grew up in the county surrounded by natural places, and contrary to the photo, I wasn't really all that interested in gardens from a young age. I was mostly I spent a lot of time outside immersed in the world of plants. So in the woods, in the fields. We live just down the road from Sandbanks Provincial Park, so we basically had the run of the place in the off season, which is just fantastic. But yes, I'm not one of those garden designers who was born with a trowel in their hand and was gardening from before they could walk. It came a bit later to me, and it came actually as a result of studying landscape architecture at the University of Guelph, which is kind of strange because it's sad to say that most landscape architects aren't exactly known for their love of plants. It's sort of an indictment of the profession, but most landscape architects want to try to be architects with the living world. So luckily for me, I had a great professor, Karen Landman, who sparked that interest in plants. We took a woody plant ID course, and that was kind of the thing that really kicked it all off for me, walking around the campus, looking and identifying all the different trees, spending lots of time in the Arboretum. So that was really what kickstarted the love of plants at Guelph. And part of that was becoming interested in the work of this guy, who is Piet Oudolf, the Dutch garden designer. Are many of you familiar with his work? Yes, no, mostly, yeah. So he's one of, if not the most famous garden designers working today. And this is a photo of him in his garden in Hummelo in the Netherlands. And he's still working. He's well into his 70s, I think now, and he's still as prolific as ever, doing projects all around the world. But the one he's probably best known for is the High Line in New York City. So this was an abandoned elevated rail line that was moving right through Chelsea and the meatpacking district in Manhattan. If you've ever visited, it's quite an amazing experience. In a way, it's almost the victim of its own success, but that's kind of a talk for a different time. But one of the main draws to the park was this lush naturalistic planting that Oudolf was responsible for along the entire length of the park. So I had read a bunch about it. I'd looked at all the planting plans. I'd seen photos after the park had opened. But when I went in person on a trip in third year while I was at Guelph with my grandma, we basically just hit a bunch of New York City parks in the summer. I was still totally blown away. So I had done all this research and learned everything I thought I knew about the project, but stepping up onto the rail line and seeing these, massive scale naturalistic plantings was a pretty transformative moment. And really what it showed me is what you can do when you understand how to use and design with plants. And the thing that's especially incredible is this is a public space. So this is a public park. But that being said, it's also probably the most ridiculously well-financed public park in history, thanks to all the billionaires in the neighborhood who just shower it with money. So it's really more like a botanical garden than your standard city park, and Highline projects are few and far between. Most of our landscapes, especially in public space, fall into the mow, blow, and go category of design. So they end up looking like this. So there's a few trees, a few meatball shrubs, lots of mulch, because who wants to look at plants when you can look at shredded bark, and lots of grass to cut all summer long. And the worst thing is we're sort of sold this as a low maintenance landscape, but it's really not, because as everyone knows, as mulch decomposes, unless you're just constantly mulching this every year, things will happen, nature takes over. So it's really not as easy care, low maintenance as we're told. So after graduating, I realized there weren't many design offices that were doing interesting work with plants. So I decided to come home and try my hand at starting a business based on that kind of love of plants and interest in planting design specifically. I don't think I really realized what a leap of faith that was at the time, to just sort of come home and try to start my own business and make a living doing that. I was lucky to be able to come home and live with my parents in Prince Edward County and live in a place that is sort of booming with expats from Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal who are interested in this school of design and have seen all of this work by Piet Oudolf and others. So it was sort of an opportune moment to come home and start doing what I was doing. So there I've been doing design work, but also doing the layout, planting installation, and then managing the gardens as they grow and evolve. And really the best education has been to be involved with the actual planting layout and management maintenance year 1, year 2, year 3, to kind of see what plants do once you put them in the ground and how they actually grow, as opposed to most landscape architects who will kind of spec out a plant list, they'll show up and help lay it out, and then they sort of walk away, their job is done, and they never go back. So that's been, again, a real education for me, is kind of seeing what plants do over time and when they're combined with each other, how they kind of compete. So this is my longest ongoing project in Prince Edward County. This is a farm on East Lake, which is, again, just down the road from where I grew up. And Rosalind, who's here tonight, has actually been to a workshop that we do at the farm. So I partner with a local florist. Her name is Sass. She owns Flora Laura flowers and grows amazing cut flowers. So we do kind of a joint workshop here at least once every summer, which is really fun. And the clients have been tremendous and super supportive, basically ever since I got started. So I started designing these naturalistic gardens at home for private clients, working on sort of small scale gardens up to bigger scale projects like the farm. But I was always keeping my eye on what was happening in public spaces. So most of our parks, and even fairly good ones, this is one in Oakville that was redesigned, I think, a few years ago. I mean, this is decent. The plants are predominantly native, but they still fall into that kind of mow, blow, and go category. Lots of mulch, widely spaced plants, nothing really, especially aesthetically spectacular. When this is not in bloom, it's really just a sea of green, so it doesn't do a lot for people. No one's going to fall in love with this kind of mass planting the way they do with the Highline. Now, there are especially ridiculous examples, and this is one in Belleville. It's not that it's ugly per se, it's just that I know it's so destined to fail. This is constantly irrigated. There's little sprinkler heads all through these beds. We've got daylilies, which are pretty indestructible, but then that whole pink swath in the middle are astilbes. And there are astilbes growing out in the blazing hot sun in the middle of a 4-lane street. So they only exist there on life support. There is no way that if you turn the tap off, those astilbes would survive. That's one part of it. The other part is, heaven forbid we actually catch any of the water that hits the road. We've got 2 curbs in the way. So rather than actually using the water that hits the street to go in and irrigate your plants, you've actually excluded it by 2 layers of concrete. And we've even got hanging baskets on the light standards here. So that's, especially bizarre to me, because everyone knows how much water hanging baskets require. So now the city is not only either paying a staff person or a contractor to water the planting, but you also have to keep the hanging baskets alive all summer too and replace them every year. And this is the kind of crazy stuff we're still doing in public space. This was built probably 2 or 3 years ago. So it's high maintenance, it's expensive, and totally unsustainable. And just down the street is this beautiful place behind a second cup. The sod's really done well, as you can see, thriving. But this was actually designed by someone, and this cost money to build. This cost money to build. Someone actually will ride a lawnmower over this and spend time of their life mowing this. And we call this design landscape, and we say that's good enough. But if you turn around in that space, this is the vacant lot right behind the second cup. And this is all completely spontaneous, undesigned, unmaintained. But again, in the heat of the summer, it's full of flowers, full of insects, full of life. And to me, this is just so much more interesting than many of the design landscapes that we see in public space. So I could spend hours here just poking around among the weeds and kind of seeing what's happening and what's living and what's showing up at different times. This will inevitably all be wiped away for when they build the next box store, subdivision, whatever. But it was a pretty stark contrast with our designed landscape versus the spontaneous landscape. So the question to ask really is, how can we make more artful interpretations of this? So plantings that can survive with basically no input from us once they're established. Plantings that are sort of climate adapted. And that was the question that was posed at a conference in Sweden in 2017 that I went to. It was organized by a guy named Peter Korn, who many of you may not have heard of, but if you follow him on Instagram, he's incredibly interesting. He does work in public space all over Sweden, but the thing that's sort of his signature is he grows everything in an 8-inch layer of sand. No soil, no compost, only sand. So this, I sort of, heard a bit about his work and knew a bit about him. But he and his partner, Julia, organized this conference called Urban Growth in 2017. And the entire focus was planting in cities and how we could do this beautiful, biodiverse, really low maintenance planting in urban environments where people don't really expect great, horticulture. So it was all really a light bulb moment for me. This is his garden, which is in Lund, or just outside of Lund in Sweden, so the southern part of Sweden. And this is his nursery. So he grows all his own plants. And again, you can see the raised beds with the timbers, just 8 inches of sand. They've got a landscape fabric layer underneath, so the plants don't root into the soil below. So they're only growing in that 8-inch layer of sand. And then he'll dig them up, he'll divide them, he'll take them to projects where he's doing plantings in public spaces. Just as bare root. I've seen these pictures on his Facebook page of his car trunk loaded with plastic bags full of bare root plants on their way to whatever new project he's working on. So it was just this whole experience blew me away, the conference and then actually seeing his garden and his nursery in person. So after that, I sort of devoured everything I could find about urban projects that were growing in gravel or sand, because I just couldn't believe that it actually worked. So I visited places like this. This is the Barbican Center in London, right in the middle of London. So again, given London's changing climate, very hot, very dry, this is actually all planting over a parking garage down below. So this basically is an entire green roof. So varying depths of substrate, but everything is planted into a green roof soil, which is really gravelly, free draining, because the whole thing with green roofs is you can't have a lot of weight on the roof. So the soil has to drain really quickly so it doesn't hold all that water. But it's this incredible, super diverse planting of perennials and grasses. There's a few trees and shrubs mixed in as well. There's, miscanthus you can see. There's globe thistle, yarrows, oreganos. I mean, it's a huge list of species, a really, really interesting palette. And this was what the former landscape looked like. So I think they had some failure with their irrigation system or something, and basically they had to wipe away the previous landscape, and they used it as an opportunity to do something new and inventive and different. But this is basically what it looked like. And again, sprinkler systems all through here because those trees could only survive on a roof if they're constantly irrigated. And this planting is virtually not irrigated at all. They may spot water by hand, maybe once or twice a summer, but really it's designed to just exist on what falls out of the sky. So a colleague of Nigel Dunnett at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and I have both of their books here tonight if you'd like to look after the talk. So James Hitchmo is another Sheffield professor. I think James Hitchmo is now retired, but I think they're both kind of edging towards retirement. But they've both been focused on this idea of what can you do in terms of beautiful biodiverse planting in public spaces. So James Hitchmo has done some really amazing work on perennial meadows from seed, and that's basically what his book Sowing Beauty is about, which I have here tonight. But he's also looking at work with 6 to 8 inch layers of pea gravel that you plant into, rather than pure sand, it's pure pea gravel, and then the plants will root into the soil underneath. So that's an example of this at a museum in the middle of London, where he's got lots of North American prairie plants, but there's also, agapanthus and some interesting South African things that would never be hardy for us, but are lovely to look at. But again, this is all planted into a layer of gravel over the soil, and the weeding is virtually zero in this garden. And the plants are still as healthy as if they were growing in soil. So back in North America, people have been working on this in Wisconsin and in the Midwest. So this is at Olbrich Botanical Garden, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. And if you ever have a chance to go to Madison, Wisconsin, it's a really, really cool city. There's a great arboretum, lots of really interesting prairie restorations in the area, but Olbrich is a wonderful botanical garden. And Jeff Epping is the director, the horticulture director there. And he's been doing sort of interesting work in this gravel garden world as well. So this is one of the gravel gardens. There's multiple kind of scattered across the garden at Olbrich. And this is a really great illustration from Jeff Epping in terms of how this works. So the idea is that you are planting plants that are in sort of 9 centimeter up to liter size pots, so not gallons because they're just a little bit too deep. The key is to have that 4 to 5 inch layer of pure gravel, and then you can see the plants are basically sitting on top of the soil below. They'll root down into the soil below, but the idea is that weed seeds are blowing into that layer of 4 to 5 inches of gravel, and when the seed hits the surface of the gravel, it gets so hot and dry that it can't root down into the soil below. It can't go through that 4 or 5 inch layer of gravel. So weeding is much, much lower than if you were planting this in soil. And for many plants that like dry conditions, that come from dry environments, their crowns, which is that point right at the surface of the gravel, really need to stay dry. So if they are growing in heavy clay, the crowns will rot and you'll lose a plant. It's not because it's not cold hardy, it's because it rots and just sits in moisture over the winter. So that's not a problem when you're planting them into this thick layer of gravel. But this is just one method, and we'll explore some others. But this is a terrific little cross section to show you how it works. So the common themes from all of these urban plantings is basically don't plant in the soil. If you want to have these really biodiverse, low maintenance perennial plantings, shrub and tree plantings in public space, soil is kind of the enemy. So you need to create really stressful conditions for plants, which also make stressful conditions for the weeds that will be fighting with your plants. So I'd seen this in person. I'd done all this traveling. I went to these conferences and read everything I could find. And really, I just needed to try it for myself and see how it actually works in our climate in Ontario. So with grant funding from the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation and from the Community Futures Foundation in Prince Edward County, I started a trial garden, actually at my elementary school in Cherry Valley, which is kind of fun. So I used to play soccer on that field and behind. And I could do an entire talk just on the trial garden, but I'll try to be efficient here. So we excavated the beds in 2018 for the first round of planting. And the guys, this is Tyler and the tractor, the guys from Lockyer's greenhouse in Picton were huge helps with their machines. My landlord actually built all the wood frames, so it was a real team effort, this garden. And all we did was we stripped away the sod and the top layer of soil to expose the sandy subsoil that was underneath. And then we placed the substrate mixtures on top of that. So there was no amending, there was no mixing, we didn't add compost, we didn't fluff it all up. We just stripped the layer away, put the new material on top, and that was it. And the idea with that is I was trying to create a process that was scalable and could be done over large areas. The more kind of fussy it is to prep a site, it just means you can't scale it across like thousands of square feet in urban areas. So trying to keep it as simple as possible. So each bed got kind of a different recipe, a different depth of either gravel and compost or recycled concrete in some cases mixed with compost. Sometimes there was some sand in there as well. So you can see just in the background, you can see all the piles of material on the parking lot. So I mixed this all up, moved it all over by hand in a wheelbarrow by myself on a weekend in the summer, which was a crazy amount of labor. In hindsight, my back didn't enjoy it. But I was just so excited at the prospect of being able to try this for myself and see how it all worked. I just was like running on adrenaline. So got it all done because, again, the teachers are going to show up and park here. So I had to clean all of these stockpiles of material off the parking lot by Monday. So it was a busy weekend. So everything in the first phase of those beds was planted in late May of 2018 with my now wife as my planting assistant. So everything went in on May 26th in these beds. For the first year, we had deer fence around the outside so that we kept the deer and the bunnies out, because I really just wanted to see first what could actually survive in these substrates, let alone subject them to the stress of rabbits and deer and all sorts of other things. Since 2018, the fence has come down, so now it's just fully open and Actually, there's been really very little browsing by the critters, which is a nice surprise. But after this day in late May 2018, I sort of walked away and thought, I'm going to show up in a few days and everything's going to be dead. Because it's recycled concrete and a little bit of, like, of course it's going to be dead. It's ridiculous. But they didn't die, which was really nice. So this is August 2nd of 2018. And you can see, I mean, again, the size of the plants going in was, you know, there's some 9-centimeter pots. A couple of things were planted as gallons. That one in my hand is a 1-liter container. And then there were some plugs, which were really very tiny. So, you know, a range of planting sizes from across the spectrum. Not all big containers or all small. It was kind of a range. But they really did mature pretty quickly. And I watered them regularly through the first couple of months. So June, July, they got watering maybe twice a week. But by August of that year, once they'd kind of rooted into the substrate or into the soil underneath, I maybe watered once from August through September. So they really became self-sufficient pretty quickly. So the blue there is an agastache, that's Blue Fortune. There's gray-headed coneflower, Carl Forster featherweed grass, which we all know, I'm sure. But yeah, in total, well over 50 plants were trialed in these 2 beds. So by 2021, by last year, it was becoming more clear which plants had sort of thrived, which were the winners and the losers, if you like. And basically, everything kind of falls into 3 categories. There's those that survived and then spread by seed. There's those that survived and kind of made a bigger clump. And then there's ones that just flat out disappeared. In the first year, really, I think only 1 or 2 plants didn't make it. There was an evening primrose that didn't seem to like the conditions, a fescue grass that didn't really do all that well. But for the most part, everything survived the first year. And then really after year 2 onwards, what ended up happening was the short-lived plants like Coreopsis and the hyssop and things that we know in our gardens only last for a couple of years before they either disappear or need to seed. Those either disappeared or started to seed themselves. So it started to behave more like a typical garden. One of the definite winners was common yarrow, as you can tell. It even started to seed like beyond the beds into the lawns, which is fun, but maybe not ideal if you're trying to go for as much diversity as possible, because you don't want to have these thug plants that are going to sort of overtake and outcompete all of the others. One of the interesting things is little blue stem, which you can see just in the right side there, has actually self-seeded really well in these beds. And you can see this is a mix of, this is concrete, recycled concrete, sand, and a little bit of compost. So it's basically 3 parts concrete, 1 part sand, 1 part compost was this recipe. And this bed is about 12 inches deep. But the interesting thing about the little blue stem is in soil, I find it almost never seeds. It also grows way too tall and flops all over the place. In recycled concrete and sand, it always stays nice and vertical, but it actually does seed itself. So it's almost like it can't do that in heavier, richer garden soil, but it can if the soil is really dry, really free draining. And I mean, the alkalinity of recycled concrete is pretty high, but it doesn't seem to bother any of these things. So again, it's just been fascinating to watch what's happened here. And this is June 23rd of this summer, so we're 4 years later. These beds in the foreground were planted in the fall of 2018, so the first phase was done in the spring at the end of May. This next phase, these beds here in the foreground were planted in early September. And they were only watered a couple of times in September, and nothing has been watered since the fall of 2018. So starting in spring of 2019, the only water that these beds got was what came out of the sky. That's it. And this is what it looks like 4 years on. And again, like I mentioned, some of the short-lived plants are starting to fade out, but they would be doing that in garden soil anyway. And really what I've been doing, it's kind of a fun project. All that upfront labor has been replaced by the fact that really all I do now is show up and see what's happening. The most work I have to do is run around with a push mower, keeping the grass cut in between the beds, because the guys that do the lawn mowing at the school have gigantic lawn mowers. So I do more work cutting the grass in between the beds than actually pulling any weeds or doing any water. And again, this is the heat of the summer. This past summer, it didn't really rain for the month of July. I don't know if it was the same here, but very, very dry June and July. And again, I didn't weed at all this year. In the past, I weeded maybe once or twice through the summer, maybe once in early June, and then again middle of the summer. But this got no weeding at all this year. So some beds do have a few, dandelions, black medic, little short weeds, but obviously nothing gets so tall and unruly that you notice it. So again, that's kind of ideal for public space where we don't have crews of gardeners to go out and do a whole bunch of weeding every week. You've got to see how much you can do with a minimal human inputs. So again, I can send a copy of this presentation, but this kind of gives a breakdown of all the different iterations of materials that I was trialing. In some of the beds, what I did is I added a 1-inch layer of pure gravel on top, and those beds seem to resist weeds a bit better than if compost comes all the way to the surface. So that was an interesting finding, kind of makes sense. The really interesting ones were the ones at the top, where it was literally nothing but crushed recycled concrete, 6 inches deep, planted stuff into it, watered it a couple of times, and then it had to fend for itself. In those beds, for the most part, the plants may be smaller, but they're not dead. So it's just fascinating. And the weeds, basically not a single weed showed up until year 4. So it took 4 years for weeds to show up at all, which is pretty amazing. So the goal of all of these recipes is I'm just trying to find mixtures that work so the plants can actually grow and they don't die. Mixtures that resist weeds, so it makes it hard for weeds to kind of seed in and then take over. And mixes that are economical, so made of cheap materials. So granite pea gravel is obviously much more expensive than crushed concrete. The concrete I got was from Napanee, and I actually had to pay more for the trucking than the actual material itself. They basically gave me the material for like $12 a yard, which is like nothing. So the trucking was more expensive than the actual material. So after doing all of this work with the trial garden, I started to use these gravel mixes on projects that I was working on for residential clients. And they're especially good for new build projects where you need to bring in soil anyway. So in some cases, like these mixes don't work. They're not a silver bullet for everything. They don't work in every location. If you have a whole bunch of mature trees, you obviously can't strip away the top 10 inches of soil because you're going to absolutely catastrophically damage your trees. But in cases like this, where we have these new build houses and we want some planting off this deck, it's perfect because we have no soil to work with there. The entire area is a war zone after you do a new construction house. So you have to bring in something. So I was kind of thinking, why not bring in these mixes that obviously work really well? So really, I'm using clients as guinea pigs. They may know it or they may not know it, but that's what's happening. To build this portfolio of work that can make a compelling case for using these mixes in public space. So, ideally you could take this to a municipality or a city and kind of say, here's how this mix works, here's all the details, all the specifications, here's how much time it takes to maintain. So really, yeah, without the clients being willing to kind of take a experimental approach, I wouldn't have as much of a portfolio to work with here. So I'll go through a couple of private garden case studies and then finish with a more in-depth look at the community living garden in Picton. So this is one in Consacon in the county, which is sort of in the northern end. Again, a very dry site, surrounded by either these black buildings that radiate heat or the gravel driveway that will radiate heat in the summer. And you can see the range of containers at planting time, again, in late May of 2019. So there's some gallons, there's some liters, there's some plugs in the black crates. I find it doesn't really make a huge difference whether you get bigger containers at the start or smaller. After year 2 or 3, the plants kind of even themselves out and you can't really tell what was planted as a big gallon pot and what was put in as a little plug. So often smaller sizes make things much more economical, especially when you're planting really densely like this. But in terms of the actual planting, it's really, you take the root ball out of the pot, you plunge it into the ground. It's just like if it was in soil. So no special technique other than that. So this is July 15th of that first year. So I put the Whirling Butterflies Gora in as kind of a first year filler just to give some color while the rest of the perennials fill out. So these didn't really come back in year 2, which often happens. They're often kind of best treated as annuals, but they give that kind of hit of color. They bloom for a long time. They give some height in year 1. So that was kind of the rationale for including them. Prairie Dropseed did fantastically well in this garden. And again, I find it's much slower in soil. It can take 3 years before you have a nice sizable clump of it, but it seems to really take off and grow quickly in these gravel and compost mixes. And again, this mix used here is 4 parts gravel, 1 part compost, and it was about 10 to 12 inches in depth. The monarchs even discovered it, which is nice. So we had butterfly weed in this garden, and the first year they got fairly decimated by the caterpillars, but that's a good thing. I explained it to the client when they were wondering why these plants had suddenly disappeared and we were left with little twigs. It's like, no, that's good. We've got, chrysalises and signs that the monarchs are happy, so this is a good thing. So this was, I guess, last year, 2021. This is kind of showing the seasonal change of this garden through the season. So late April, we've got the grass, blue moorgrass, which is Cecularia hoofluriana. Really nice grass and has these kind of black flower heads really early in the season. So basically, as soon as you do the cutback in April, after everything is left standing all winter, you almost immediately have this flush of new green coming through, which makes a big difference. Everyone wants to see green after the depths of Canadian winters. This is the same view on May 23rd. So ballerina tulips, thalia, daffodils, prairie smoke, which is a little pink perennial blooming in the bottom. So bulbs actually do really well in these mixtures, and I find squirrels are less of a problem because they don't like digging through gravel, which is interesting. So they don't dig up your tulips, which is nice. If you have bunnies, they'll still come along and eat them, of course, but at least you have the bulbs underground. Same view on the 19th of June. So we've got alliums. Everything is kind of gaining in height. There's this pale mauve purple Monarda bradburyiana, which is a really nice native plant, slowly becoming more available in the trade. This is the end of June. So penstemons, echinaceas, the butterfly weed is in flower now. Alliums are kind of giving the seed head interest after they've finished. Another close-up of the echinacea simulata with the penstemons and the monarda just fading in the bottom there, so just finishing. So again, it's having this kind of sequence of bloom. You can pack a ton of diversity into these areas because no one plant is really predominating and outcompeting all the others. So you can have this choreography kind of going from April all the way through until the end of October. So here again, same view, September, early September, the stiff blazing star, Liatris aspera, the brown-eyed Susans. You can see there's some nice color coming from the penstemons there as well. So even after they've flowered, they're giving something later in the season. The prairie dropseed is blooming. So again, tons of diversity. There's probably 20 to 25 species in this area. That's maybe 12 feet by 20 feet. It's not a huge bed, but we could pack a lot into it, and it doesn't look out of control, I think, anyway. This is another project, a new build in the county. So this Corten steel terrace was built in front of the house, and you can see the soil we're working with underneath, i.e. there isn't any. So the idea was for this whole terrace to be one big gravel garden. So we left a strip unplanted down the middle that you could sort of walk through the planting, but nothing underneath here was soil. Everything used as a base was either pure gravel or a mix of gravel and compost. It was planted late because construction took a while, which is always kind of a frustrating thing. Like you never want to be planting on July 15th. It's just not a good idea, but that's what happened at this project. So And again, just like planting in soils, these do take watering that first summer to get everything rooted. So it's not like it's, a magic thing. You can just put the plant in and walk away. You do still need to water in the first year. But then in 2020, the year after, this is kind of the seasonal change, what happens in late May, everything coming out of the ground. Early June, there's this big pulse with the allium purple rain. So again, bulbs do really well. I have found that the alliums don't always come back for a second year when they're planted in gravel. I think it's just, it may be they don't have quite enough nutrient to kind of fuel the bulb for the following year. So a slight drawback, but even if you just think of them as annuals, there's lots of cheap bulbs that you can plant en masse every fall and just, you still get that hit of color in the spring. And this is July of last year. So the tall scabious Cephalaria gigantea, which has probably the worst Latin name of any plant you could think of. Sounds like a disease. So there's Cephalaria, there's butterfly weed, the orange, the prairie clover, Dahlia purpurea, which is just flowering in front. In combination here with Echinacea paradoxa, which is a species, a wild echinacea that grows down in the US Midwest, but is super drought tolerant. And fairly reliably perennial as well. There are lots of echinaceas in the world that don't actually come back for a second season, but this one is a good, reliable plant. And in October, this is what it looks like with the showy goldenrod and the October skies aster, which is blooming down below. The showy goldenrod was a sort of revelation here. I never expected it to get as tall as it did. So you could actually go through and keep this a bit shorter if you did the kind of Chelsea chop method to cut the plants back in June so they don't get quite as tall. But considering this is only growing in gravel and compost, it's kind of amazing that you still get these 5 or 6 foot tall goldenrods out of it. So again, the more plants I'm trying on all of these projects, so a lot of these species weren't in the trial garden. So every new job that includes a new plant or something I haven't tried is a test. But for the most part, everything has been a success so far. And in October, you get the seed heads. So the beautiful seed heads of the butterfly milkweed in the top, the prairie clover down below, the Monarda bradburyiana again in the bottom right. So the seed head interest is really nice, and that's why, again, I like to keep all of this stuff standing through the winter because it will sort of hold the snow. You leave the seeds for birds. You leave the stems for insects to nest in, all of that good habitat stuff. But if you leave the seeds, you do get self-seeding. So again, because there's compost in the mix all the way to the surface, the columbine has seeded all the way through here. The showy goldenrod seeded quite a bit as well. So there is a bit of maintenance that needs to be done to keep the seedlings in check. Otherwise, you sort of lose the balance and the kind of integrity of the planting. But it's so easy to just go through with the hoe and kind of skim the seedlings off. It takes no work because you can just push it through the gravel with almost no effort. So it can be done pretty easily, just a couple of times in the spring, and then it takes care of those unwanted seedlings. So I'm so captivated by these ideas. I'm even using these gravel mixes and on the right, pure sand in my own nursery beds now. So I'm basically just lifting what Peter Korn is doing in Sweden and trying it in Ameliasburg and Prince Edward County. So I've got the bed on the right was all done last year. These are a whole bunch of grasses that I had either as extras or as plugs. So again, the idea being I just kind of hill them in the sand, water them a couple of times, let them kind of bulk up and fill out, and then I'll dig them and take them to projects when I need them. Which is nice because then you don't have a bunch of pots left over either. You can just dig these bare root plants, put them in a crate, drive them to the job, put them in the ground. So to finish up, I'll focus on this case study in Picton at the Community Living Office, which is on King Street. And this is the very depressing image of what it looked like pre-gravel gardening. So there's tons of spaces like this in towns and cities where you just think, what is the point of this lawn? Like, what is it doing? It may as well be concrete, really, when you think about it. Someone has to mow this, someone has to maintain this. No one's gonna sit and have a picnic on this. No one's gonna throw a ball around with their kids on. Like, it's just this ridiculous little green postage stamp lawn. So there's tons of potential for these gardens all through cities across Ontario and, I mean, everywhere. So I spent 5 minutes on Google Maps and I found one example in Ottawa. So that's at the War Museum. That could easily be a gravel garden. What's the point of that lawn? Doing nothing. There's another one. 5 minutes on Google Maps and I found 2. So, I mean, there's tons of space in cities that could easily be something else that doesn't have to be lawn. The only reason it's lawn is because everyone knows how to ride a lawnmower and how to maintain this. But if you add up all the areas of these sort of random postage stamps that are left over, it turns into acres of habitat if you think about them being converted into something else. The key thing is just to find a method that can be rolled out and repeated and easily maintained. So the community living garden, this is again, these are the guys from Lockyer's coming in really handy for me. Again, all we did was excavate the existing soil to get down to the subsoil underneath. So it looked like that after we'd done all the digging. Obviously locate all your utilities first, very important. And this was again, the 4-to-1, basically 4-to-1 ratio of a washed limestone screenings. They call it high performance bedding gravel. It's basically limestone screenings, but they wash the stone dust out of it. So it's a cleaner material. And then the compost is just a leaf and yard waste compost from the green bin programs, which is really nice. It's becoming much more accessible to find compost that's been produced properly and isn't full of weed seeds and weird stuff. But the contractor who works with me all the time, who mixed all of this up at his yard, when he was bringing the trucks, he looked at me and said, "You think anything's going to grow in this crap?" I was like, "Well, I really hope so, because this is a fairly public site for one thing." But I did have some confidence having done the trial garden earlier that year. And then to finish it off, it was mulched with 1 inch of granite pea gravel over top. For really mostly aesthetic benefits rather than functional. It does keep the weeds down a little bit because, again, they've got to go through the pea gravel before they get to the compost layer. But we also had the slight problem of local cats using the gravel as a litter box to start, which was unpleasant. Having the pea gravel on the top seemed to deter that. They didn't seem to like to roll around on the pea gravel as much. But it was only really a problem in the very early days. I haven't seen any signs of cats since. But again, this is part of the, in a weird way to say exciting, but interesting learning opportunities doing stuff in public space. You have no idea these things will happen until you do them. So you have to learn the hard way. And speaking of learning the hard way, planting in early September of 2018 was murder because it was 30 degrees, humid. It was one of those sort of late summers that, we have this dip in August and then suddenly it's 30 degrees all of September. So brutally hot, and a good demonstration of what's called the urban heat island effect. If any of you know what that means, it's basically all the radiated heat from all the hard surfaces, parking lots, sidewalks, buildings, amplifies all the heat that's coming from the sun anyway. So this is like, south and west facing. So you're getting baked by the sun, but then it's also coming off the building, coming off the sidewalk, coming off the parking lot. Yeah, just ungodly hot. I don't know that I've ever worked on a hotter site. And again, my now wife was helping me with this planting. So that was a good sign. She didn't ditch me. So yeah, good demonstration of the urban heat island effect. And again, planting installation was pretty simple. This is a standard 1 gallon pot of Chicago Apache daylily, planted as if you're planting in garden soil. The only thing that added one step to this is sort of wiping away the pea gravel layer first, planting into the compost, and then kind of moving the pea gravel back around the crown of the plant. But again, that's all pretty easily done. So that's what it looked like in the fall of 2018. So things had maybe a couple of weeks by this point. And again, just like the fall planted beds in the trial garden, this was watered 3 or 4 times in the fall and then has never been watered since. So everything went in the fall, was watered through the fall, and had to fend for itself from 2019 onwards. And a nice benefit of the pea gravel, as well as deterring the neighborhood cats, is it looks really nice after a rain. It kind of brings out the color, and this building is prominently pink. So nice to kind of I don't know, temper the color of the building a little bit with the pea gravel. So again, looking at what the stresses of winter bring to planting in public space, especially along a sidewalk, you can see down below along that edge, you see those piles of salt? There have been studies that have actually been done where the worst offenders for over application of salt on sidewalks are private businesses. It's not the city. The city's too cheap. They don't really want to spend all that money on salt. But private businesses are so scared of lawsuits, they oversalt everything. So if you look at supermarkets, if you look at shopping malls in the winter, you're like crunching on all the salt as you walk up the sidewalk. And again, that's exactly what happened here. They have people with special needs, people with mobility issues, so they don't want anyone taking a slip and fall here. So the salt is copious. And when it rains, or when you have flash melts in the middle of February or March, all of that salt washes into the planting bed and goes through all of the gravel mix, through the root zone of all the plants. So another good test. Another good test as well is there was a huge stockpile of snow from the neighbor. So the only place the neighbor could put their snow is in this section of this bed. So it was like a 6-foot high mound of snow. And when it melted in the spring, you see all the nice stuff that was in that snow pile has now melted and sunken down to the bottom. So we've got hunks of asphalt and brick and sand from their driveway and all sorts of nice things. So all this really took is I kind of raked it out just to clean it up a little bit in the spring. But again, it's one of these things of you can never anticipate these things until you see them in practice. And you never really fully understand how much stress a public planting is under until you have to work in one. Because the other thing is, as you can see in this photo, you see that yellow sort of support wire for the hydro pole? That is the local dog marking spot. So anything planted in the vicinity of that area is getting a different kind of irrigation as the neighborhood dogs go by. All good things to learn. But really, I was sort of quietly nervous all winter about whether this would work because I planted this in the fall, the same fall that I had done the trial garden in the spring. So I hadn't actually seen anything come through a winter by the time I had done this. So I'm looking at all this stuff, all the salt, all the debris, thinking about all the dogs, the fluctuations in temperature when it goes really warm and then suddenly dips down to -20. And I'm thinking, oh my God, is anything going to be alive in the spring? But again, because I'm here talking about it, it's true. Things actually did live. So this is April of 2019. So it looks really clean, but there's lots of green coming up. The nice thing for the, neat and tidy crowd is this actually looks really clean as a garden space. There's lots of, wild gardens, wildlife gardens that look pretty horrendous, especially in March and April. But if you see like this nice clean plain of pea gravel and all the new fresh green growth coming out of it, I think even the most fastidious, weed-obsessed gardeners would be okay with this. And again, that's important because this is public space. You're not dealing with just the converted eco, wildlife-friendly gardeners. You're dealing with everybody, so it's got to look good and have some aesthetic appeal for everyone. So again, big sigh of relief by June of 2019, seeing everything happily growing away. The bloody cranesbill, which is a little pinky purple down below, that's been a real standout in this garden. It's indestructible. Has actually seeded itself, which again I've never seen it do in soil, but it's seeded all over the place in this garden, which is great. Just acts as a little ground cover filler plant. And again, no watering all through 2019, so it basically had to fend for itself. There were a few plants in here that over sort of 2019, 2020 faded away. There was an aster called Lady in Black that has really nice burgundy foliage, but it was just a little bit too hot and dry for that. What else? There was a dwarf maiden grass that didn't really make it through the first winter, but again, that's no big loss. For the most part, I would say at least 80% of the initially planted things are still there, if not have self-seeded. So the edges are always going to be the refuges for weeds. Where this edge meets the driveway, there's just a little bit of soil, and because we couldn't excavate the base of the driveway without undermining the asphalt of the neighbor, just not a neighborly thing to do, there's a little bit of soil, so just enough to get a little seam of weeds along the edges. But it seems to happen at the edge of every sidewalk. That's where you seem to get the weeds, because they're not as subjected to the competition with other plants. Because you can't obviously plant literally up to the edge. So that's always going to be the place where you get the most weeds. So it's not to say you won't have a single weed, but it is much, much lower than if this whole area was triple mix and pine bark mulch or something. So this is August of that same first year. The daylilies are in flower, the sedum is blooming, butterfly milkweed, echinaceas. Some shrubs are incorporated in this garden as well. So there's a bush honeysuckle, which is deer villa Kodiak orange. There's a dwarf smoke bush as well. So this does also work for shrubs and woody plants. I find with public space though, it's good to lean a little more heavily on the perennials, just so you have that color going all the way through the season and you don't have these down moments where it doesn't really offer any wow factor for people. So in terms of a 1-year evolution, this is where we started in April 6th of 2019. And that's the same view by October 13th with no water. So the asters, this is an aster called Radon's Favorite, and it's in bloom right now. I drove by this morning, it's in peak bloom. It actually doesn't really start blooming until the middle of October, and then we'll go well into November. So it's an incredible plant, really good for late season pollen for bees and butterflies before they kind of shut things down for the winter. But the asters were planted as plugs. They were literally 2 or 3 little leaves in the fall of 2018. And by the fall of 2019, 1 year later, they're like 3 foot by 3 foot, shrub-sized plants. So again, it just goes to show you don't need to go gallon, 2 gallon. You don't need to start with big stuff. So again, 2021, just last year, this is April 17th. So you get color from things like the Pulsatilla vulgaris, a past flower. So to have color on April 17th from a perennial is pretty good. And the interesting thing, one of the many interesting things about gravel gardens is because they heat up quicker than soil, you get things blooming ahead of schedule in a gravel garden. So I've done another garden in the public park just across the street from community living. I planted the exact same dwarf iris bulbs in both places. And in the gravel garden, they bloom almost 2 weeks ahead of blooming in the park across the street. So just because the temperatures rise that much quicker with the gravel, they're warming up so much quicker, they kind of push everything a week or 2 ahead of what they would be doing in soil. So again, May 27th, we've got the purple rain alliums, the geraniums flowering. You can see things have grown in much more now. So again, just 3 years in, it's basically a fully mature planting. Some self-seeding starting to happen too, which can be a blessing and a curse, as we know. The courthouse beds in the back they've been interesting because there's more self-seeding plants happening there. So the columbine, the chives, there's a wild dianthus that I've used there as well. So those have self-seeded, but they've self-seeded without actually outcompeting anything else, which is interesting. So it takes on this really dynamic kind of quality without becoming a mass of one thing. So again, that's a good benefit because the seedlings will just continue to cover the ground and fill any gaps that weeds would otherwise occupy, but they're not, they play well with each other. They're not going to outcompete their neighbors. And another cool thing that's happened is there's been some echinacea funny business going on. So there's 3 different species of echinacea, and I think these hybrids are a cross between the Tennessee coneflower, Echinacea tennesseeensis, and Echinacea purpurea prairie splendor. So there's 2 different varieties that I think have hybridized, because I noticed these seedlings popping up toward the edge of the sidewalk, and the leaf didn't really look like one or the other. So I said, okay, well, let's let this play out and see what happens. And this is the result, which is a pretty stunning thing. It has these really nice tall stems that the purple coneflower has, but you can see how the petals are sort of horizontal, which is similar to the Tennessee coneflower. So you basically get the best of both worlds, really nice dark stems, I find these actually bloom before the straight purple coneflower does, and they bloom later into the season. Some of the flowers can be like as big as my hand too. So I'll be keeping seed from this and try to move the seedlings away from the edges just so they're not kind of falling into the sidewalks. But a really, really cool kind of spontaneous, serendipitous thing. And again, could have easily been weeded out, but I just kind of thought, let's just see what happens. Pretty interesting. And again, this is the courthouse section a little later. So after the columbines and the chives finish, we've got Echinacea pallida, which is another species. And then this is the wild dianthus that I mentioned. This is Dianthus carthusionorum. So it looks like a little pink that we are normally used to seeing as like a little 6 to 8 inch tall thing. But this one gets 2.5 feet tall and has a really nice kind of airy flower. The seed heads are nice and dark and black on this as well. So even after it flowers, it has some interest in the winter. And I have done some editing in these beds because initially I did have the wild yarrow, which we know from the trial gardens, seeds everywhere. So I did have to make the hard decision and weed out all the yarrow, so there isn't a single yarrow left in here. But the reason that was done is it's really important in public space to keep things legible. And the yarrow was getting so tall and leafy that it was obscuring all the other things underneath. So it just looked like mush. It didn't have any kind of sharpness. You couldn't see the tall stuff emerging out of the lower layer. And these are really important things in public space. You don't want it to look like just a jungle that's been forgotten. You want it to look like it has some design intention behind it. The other problem is when things got tall and leafy, they then flopped onto the walkways, which resulted either last fall or in the fall of 2020, with the landlord calling a local weed whacker guy to mow the whole thing down in October. Like just as the asters are in peak bloom, the whole thing gets weed whacked to the ground. And I called him and kind of said, what was happening there? He said, oh yeah, we had, people complaining about plants on the sidewalk. Like, okay, that's fine. Call me next time and I'll do it. I'll look after the cutback and kind of keep things under control. So this year what I did is, again, I went in and some of the Gora was self-seeding too much and kind of falling over. So everything was reined in a little bit. So hopefully, and it hasn't been done so far, which is a good sign, no weed whacking this fall. So again, the idea is always you want it to be wild, but you want it to be by design, hence the name. And again, this is a shot at the front in the heat of the summer. So the Prairie Splendor purple coneflower. You can see just to the right of that, that's the radon's favorite aster. So it'll just sit as kind of a green mound for most of the summer, and then it erupts into these purple daisies in the middle of October, just when you think everything's done. Again, the butterfly weed, you can see just on the right, that's the dwarf smoke bush that's done really well. But again, nice and dense and lush with no watering since the fall that it was planted. So needless to say, I think there's lots of potential with these gardens, and that's all I've got for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you all for listening.
We have some questions, but people start with any questions from the audience. We have some from online too. I'll start with one from online while you have you can give a thought too. We've got time for both. But Ben, thanks very much. It was wonderful. Norley was asking, I've started a pollinator garden on a roadside in town. Very poor gravelly soil,
yep,
though quite varied in quality. Some but not all plants are doing quite well. But any suggestions to make it work better?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sort of trial by fire with the plant palettes, because especially with roadsides, there are just certain things that can't handle salt, for example. So in this garden, the prairie dropseed, the wine cups, which is the pink flower you can see in the corner of this photo, have done really well adjacent to the sidewalk. But as long as the soil is free draining, that's kind of the main thing that's going to work in your favor. Because the more stress you have for plants, the more stress you also have for weeds. So as long as you can find a palette of plants that can work well in those really bone dry environments. And again, looking to the wild for inspiration is always a good place to start. Looking in reference books and finding things that grow in really dry habitats. I would say generally you sort of have to shift your mindset from the standard garden plants, like, forget dahlias, they're just not going to work. But as long as you go sort of in that dry zone, I think there's some really interesting things to try. And I would just say try stuff.
Yeah, like you've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, once you find the survivors, you just go big with the survivors and experiment, try a few new things. But once you know they work, you can go crazy with them.
We had another question. Have you tested the gravel gardens in the shade?
Yeah, actually, I have. Yeah, I've done one that gets a fair bit of shade, and I found a lot of shade plants do really well, like the woodland phlox, foam flowers, sedges. A lot of different sedges do really well. Yeah, so it works. It works just as well for shade plants. The tricky thing is, again, as I mentioned, this really doesn't apply under mature trees, though. Like I would not recommend going and either burying the root zone of trees in like 6 to 8 inches of this gravel mix, or digging out a bunch of the soil under a tree, because you're going to kill the tree. But if you've got shade from a building and you've got room to play with the soil, then yeah, it easily works with shade plants too.
Thanks, yeah. And thanks, Kathy, for the question. And any questions from the audience yet? Or?
I loved your talk. It was so interesting.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how, I know you're using native plants, but how do you think about ratios, or just what works, or how often are you trying to bring in the natives?
Yeah, I would always try to prioritize them, of course. Like it's great to find native plants that can handle these conditions. So like the wild echinaceas, the butterfly milkweed, those sorts of things. But the main point of emphasis for me, I think in public planting especially, is A, does it survive? So if it's a native plant that doesn't survive, it's of no use. But then B, does it sort of bring some flowering or some interest all the way through the season? So if there's a down moment when native plants from dry areas aren't in flower, that's where a non-native plant might be really valuable to give you that early moment. So like the pulsatilla, for example. There are very few native plants that would be in bloom in mid-April. So that's an example where it's a survivor. It likes those conditions. It's not going to invade anywhere. Obviously, I would not recommend using invasive species or things that are really aggressive, because, again, for biodiversity value, it's going to outcompete all the other things. So again, that's no use either. So yeah, I would always prioritize natives. I don't have like a strict rule of like it's got to be at least 50%. But again, I like so many native plants that I just want to include them anyway. Now, again, it's also a bit of a trade-off, because there are some native plants like the yarrow that are just too aggressive. So then you have to say, okay, if there's a non-native version that doesn't do the self-seeding thing, that's actually a more useful plant in this context. So there's all of these things that you're kind of weighing when you make those decisions.
I've got a public space which faces the west, so it doesn't get full sun. What would you recommend? Would you recommend a mix of pea gravel and compost, or must be I'm more attracted to a layer of pea gravel over some soil?
Yeah, so there's pros and cons to both. The gravel and compost, if you use that as a mix, that's going to behave more like a soil. So you'll get weeds, you'll get things self-seeding. So it will take a certain amount of refereeing and intervention. The nice thing about the pure gravel mix over soil is the weeds are virtually zero, but you don't get the self-seeding. So if you use short-lived plants, like a coreopsis or like the gora or something that needs to self-seed, if it grows and blooms and goes to seed and can't, you lose that plant. So again, that's sort of a trade-off as the plant palette goes. But in terms of the simplest, lowest maintenance, yeah, a deep layer of pure gravel or pure sand would be a better route than including compost, just because the compost will make it more and more soil-like.
But I'm concerned because the bed doesn't get full sun until after 12.
Yeah. So what I would still recommend, though, is choosing plants that can take full sun, because they're going to be getting the heat of the day, right?
Yeah.
Like if it was going to get sun in the morning and shade all afternoon, that's where I would say shade plants, conventional woodland plants would be a good choice. But if you're going to get blasted with the heat of noon onwards, even if it's shaded in the morning, I would still say go for plants from sunnier places.
Full sun plants that grow very well there.
Yeah.
But that's in soil, so okay, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Now, the thing to keep in mind too with the approaches that are pure gravel is because the gravel literally has no organic matter in it, it does take more watering to get the plants to root into the soil underneath. So for the first, 4 to 6 weeks, you may have to do regular watering like twice a week or something, because it's just more important to get the plants to root in and they have nothing to rely on in the substrate itself. If there was compost, you could water it like once a week because at least they've got the compost in the mix to draw from. But that's again, the trade-off with pure gravel is you need to do more upfront watering to get them to root. But once they've rooted into the soil, they behave as if they've just grown in that soil forever.
Just one more question. Where do you get your gravel or pea gravel? Is it readily available?
The granite pea gravel is a pretty standard product at like every landscape yard will have it. It's sort of a 3/8 inch size. People use them for walkways. They actually don't really work very well, I find, as walkways because they roll under your feet. But yeah, it's a pretty standard product. You would easily be able to find that. If you're using sand, I usually use the sand. It's called filter media sand, so it's a bit coarse. It's not like beach sand. It's not soft. It's actually the sand they use in septic fields to kind of drain the fluids from septic fields.
You mentioned screening, limestone screening.
Yeah. So I wouldn't use screenings because of the stone dust. And the thing with the stone dust is it means it all compacts. So you don't get the infiltration isn't as good and you do get more weeds. So the screenings that I use are called high performance bedding gravel. And again, most aggregate suppliers will have that or they'll have a source for it because it's becoming more common to use as a base for pavers in landscaping. But yeah, that has the benefit of it's just a cleaner material and it doesn't have the dust, which is kind of a drawback from screenings. Yeah,
This is being a revelatory area that my garden is close to the canyon beach and I don't have sand.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a really soft sand, so I don't know if this technically works. A couple of questions. Firstly, you did mention you had a dwarf tinus and then there was another woody plant.
Yep.
So you do use mostly herbaceous perennials. And I think at some point you mentioned something about using woodies.
Yep.
And I just wonder if you can walk me through your thinking on that and why you don't use them more.
Yeah, so again, I mean, the woody plants, so in this photo, before they've leafed out, that's the dwarf smoke bush called Young Lady on the right. And then you can see on the left, coming into leaf, that's the bush honeysuckle. The main reason I prioritize the perennials over woody plants is woody plants, unless you can sort of cut them back really hard, will incrementally get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it just means they sort of occupy more space. And if you want to do sort of as much with diversity and flowering all the way through the season, you just space is at a premium. But no, I'm not averse to using them. In some cases where you need to fill a lot of space really quickly, woody plants would probably be a better choice because they would fill out and occupy more ground than a bunch of little tiny perennials. Like you'd have to plant thousands of those versus like hundreds of shrubs. So yeah, there's a place for everything, but I'm mostly trying to get like as much color and much flower power as possible. So I've just found myself leaning more towards perennials. And the nice thing is they're mature after like 2 or 3 years. So you don't have to wait for woody plants to kind of gain that size.
And I love the clean look you get with the pea gravel.
Yeah, it's nice. So yes, that's a very important point. When you cut this back in the spring, it has to get cut back and you take all the material away. Because if you cut it back and just sort of leave all the material, that's going to build up organic matter and you're going to get more weeds and more seeding happening in the surface. So what I do here, a hedge trimmer is a really good tool because you just zip it low over all the perennial stuff. And again, that's the benefit of doing more with perennials and less with woody things. You can sort of treat it almost like a meadow and cut the whole thing back to the ground. But everything gets cut back to the ground, taken away, and then leaf blower over the top of this to like clean all the little debris and stuff. Pardon? Nope. Nope. As long like you can sort of adjust the settings, and with the battery powered ones too, you can kind of adjust whether it's giving you like hurricane force leaf blower or just kind of a gentle breeze. But yeah, for the most part, it'll blow, especially if you cut back the material when it's dry. it'll blow all of that stuff, no problem, and it will leave the gravel as it is. Yeah, but it is important to keep it clean. Yeah.
On your closing slide, you had a big blooming pinkish flower. I wasn't sure it was in here or would that be coming there? What is that?
Yeah, so that's wine cups. The Latin name is Calero involucrata. So it's another prairie plant that grows more in the Midwest. Like I don't think it's actually native to Ontario. It's more probably Kansas, Missouri, that kind of part of the world. But again, yeah, that was planted as one little 9-centimeter pot, and it makes like a sprawling mound, like 3 feet across. So there's benefits and consequences. Pardon?
I couldn't quite hear you. Can you spell it?
Callirhoe. And then the second name is involucrata, which is INVOLUCRATA. Or wine cups, if you like. Most nurseries should know that too. But if you go with the Latin, there's no confusion over what you mean by wine cups. Any more questions?
What do you think is like the biggest obstacle from this style of planting, maybe the urban areas of the city?
Yeah, I mean, technically there are really low obstacles because it's really simple to just dig out some soil and put in this new material and mix it up and away you go. The biggest obstacle is probably the level of plant knowledge for what plants would work and how to put together mixes of things that aren't going to be outcompeted by others, and you know, how to avoid those like poison pill plants that are going to take over at the expense of everything else. So the plant knowledge probably is the main drawback because, again, most landscape architects, city plant, like they kind of have their standard list of like 30 trees and shrubs and a few ground covers that they know are indestructible, and they're like, that's all I need to know. So that's one downfall. And then again, some of these plants that are really useful and interesting just aren't widely available yet in the trade either.
See that changing? Kind of,
Yeah, I think there's more and more demand, and like you're seeing more native plants show up at garden centers in the spring. I remember talking to Paul Zammit, who used to be the director of horticulture at the Toronto Botanical Garden. And he, in a previous life, worked at a big nursery in Toronto. And he said the problem with most native plants is they're ugly ducklings in a pot. So when you see them on a sales bench at a nursery, you go, oh, it's just a couple of leaves. Like, I don't need that in my garden. I want the purple coral bells because look at how beautiful that is, even though they're terrible plants. So that's one drawback is people need to kind of see more of it to kind of know that when they go to the nursery and get a little pot of wine cups that has like 2 leaves, it's going to turn into that. So yeah, there are obstacles, but I think really it's nothing insurmountable. Like the more people can see this, it's really not, hopefully, as complicated as it needs to be. But it's a lack of plant knowledge, and then the lack of people who have the knowledge to maintain it as well. Again, it's pretty simple to maintain. It's sort of go through and weed it a couple of times a year, cut it back once a year. It's not asking a lot. And if you have someone who can train the staff that are doing the maintenance, then so much the better. But you know, people who have horticultural knowledge are not as common as they should be, ideally. Yeah.
We've had some more compliments online. A lot of people say they really enjoyed the presentation.
Cool, thank you.
A couple more questions too, but just a message for those of you who are here in person. DJ Smith, our membership secretary. DJ, thank you very much for coming in. If you don't have your membership card yet, if you renewed online, DJ has his card. If you'd like to renew your membership or you're a member of the public and want to join the Horticultural Society, which is only $15 a year to support our activities, you can see DJ to sign up. So please, thanks very much for coming in. Also, we had a question from Sylvia Strobel. But she was just asking about how your approach has changed. So you talked about your plants evolving over the years, but she was saying, well, you know, how's that changed in your experience, and specifically which species do well in the 80-20 limestone screening compost mix?
Yeah, the better question would be what doesn't do well. Okay. Honestly, even in the community living garden, like there's daylilies that are growing in this. which I would have thought at the outset was a bit of a stretch, but I mean, it seems to work. Obviously, I wouldn't, hydrangeas, rhododendrons, like you could you can eliminate some things just by, knowing which are the kind of water hungry plants. But really the fun thing for me is pretty much at every new project where I'm trying this method, I'm not just trying the same mix of plants. So everywhere I go, I'm kind of building this list, and the results really so far is the more I try, the more succeeds. So it's just a really fascinating thing. And again, if we go back to Peter Korn's nursery way back at the beginning, the thing that one of the many things that blew me away was he's got things like, maiden grass. He's got heleniums in here, which are like a marsh plant, and they're growing in sand. He's got sanguisorba, thalictrum, like all these plants that are from really marshy, rich soil environments. He's growing them in sand. I've grown woodland phlox in sand. I've grown primroses in sand, and like I think really that's a lot of the fun of it, is just trying stuff that you think there's no way this should work, and then seeing if it actually does.
And Peter Korn's nursery, I think you mentioned that there's landscape fabric underneath those beds. There's no pre-treatment or loosening up of the substrate, just like the beds we made at the school.
Yep.
Okay. Just to address another question from online, you're just putting your substrate over top.
Yeah. Now with most of the projects, like you can see here, it's open to the soil below. So the landscape fabric, the only reason he's using that is because when he's going to dig plants out, he doesn't want to have to dig the roots out of the soil underneath.
Okay.
Because again, then it's going to sort of bring the soil up from below and mix it with the sand, and then it starts to lose its integrity. But on a project where it's going to be a long-term planting, there's no need for the fabric. Like just let the plants go down into the subsoil. But yeah, I've done the same thing in my nursery beds as well. Lined the bottom so they're easy to dig up. So again, below these beds, there's a layer of fabric underneath, just so when I want to go and dig things out, I don't have to reef them out of the soil underneath. Yeah.
Well, I think, any other questions? Ben, I wanted to thank you very much on behalf of the society. You've driven a long way to come here tonight, so thanks, Frank.
No, my pleasure.
It's been a memorable presentation for us. I think it's given us inspiration for how we can see different public spaces in Ottawa.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.
I'll just close the meeting off. Good night, everyone.